help me hand those out?
Yep.
Just like maybe one every other person, you know, just.
Oh, I know. I always pack it for the As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to hand out some of the documents that Jared will be speaking to. But we will also be making this available on the website. But I only have like 27 of them. Could you share amongst your departments? So just raise your hand if you need one. Again, I'm going to have them available as soon as I can, early next week on the website. So, who wants one? I'll take this.
The PowerPoint that we'll have up is in the packet, so you'll be able to follow along on the screens, but it should be maybe one for every 2 to 3 people. I apologize. We had a very good turnout today, I guess.
I have 2 more left. Oh, no, no.
Are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here this morning. Am I sounding okay? Too loud? Not loud enough? There's feedback? Bring it down maybe a little bit. Are you really asking me to sing my presentation? I don't know if I want that. I was doing a presentation yesterday and the projector didn't work, and so the suggestion was that I mime it out. I don't know what would be worse, that or singing. Way down. All right. Keep trying. That better? Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thank you for having me this morning. My name is... You still getting it?
Yeah. You get us, that mic should be off. These mics should be off.
I think they are.
No, that one I think so.
What did you do to Andy? Hello? Hello? Give me that square thing.
Square thing. Check.
I don't know what I'm doing with it. Try that. I'm going to go get Rich.
All right. I think maybe I'm talking too loud, so I'll try to stay a little bit lower volume. My name is Jared Hoy. I work for the Department of Corrections.
Maybe if you stop.
Sorry, guys. Yeah.
Seems to be.
I need to find the one spot that it's going to work. Was the other gentleman standing here and it was working?
Yeah.
So maybe stick right here?
Yes.
Is that what you think? If it works?
Either that or turn that mic down.
Turn this mic down?
Yeah.
Is there a way to...
Turn down on that part. I'm not actually seeing these yet, though, so I'll give it a shot. Usually they have these set when I'm here. Not sure how these work. just needs to come down in here.
Okay. All right. Right now.
Okay, I'm gonna keep talking here and see how this works. We're okay? All right.
So where? You want it down? You want it up?
Up a little bit.
He can't hear. Okay. No, you're fine. Go ahead, keep talking.
Okay. So my name is Jared Hoy. I'm from the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. I have been working on the COMPAS project since we initiated it in 2010, along with Tiana and her staff here in Eau Claire. So I feel sort of almost intimidated.
Sorry.
Nope, it's okay.
Is it on? Oh, he's not hearing it.
Oh no.
No, it's not. Hang on. Let me turn it down before you turn it on, before you get the feedback. Okay, go ahead. Push and hold it. Oops.
I'm not sure.
Slight technical difficulties here. Okay, it's on.
Okay. We'll try again. So to keep talking. So I was saying we initiated the COMPAS implementation here in Eau Claire. Actually, Tiana and her staff were using COMPAS prior to the department. And so I look at many of you as the experts and certainly at least having some experience or background with risk need assessment. Now I'm going to try not to stand in front of the screen. So I've been on this project for about 5 years. I was on the initial team that sort of did a nationwide search and literature review of the different risk and need assessment tools across the country when the department was trying to find a risk needs tool to replace our old 502 tool, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But my background, I have a bachelor's in psych and a master's in counseling, and I'm more of a counselor therapist by trade, but do a lot of different things at the department now. I work in the office of the secretary, so I'm certainly familiar with a lot of the processes and policies and procedures throughout the field in DCC and community corrections as well as in the prison system. Some of the things, my knowledge ends at a certain point because I don't work directly in those divisions, so I'll try to field any questions I can that may not be directly related to COMPAS, but more about general practice in the department. Otherwise, I'll try to get the answers that I can after, if I don't know them off the top of my head. But at any rate, so for the next, we'll shoot for about an hour and 15 minutes. Please chime in, raise hands. The more interactive, the better, as far as I'm concerned. For the next hour and 15 minutes, we'll go through the PowerPoint slides. You have some materials in front of you that I'll kind of orient you to as we're going along. And I want to leave at least 15 minutes, if not a half hour, for some questions at the end. I did receive a few questions from Tiana in advance, so I've tried to incorporate those either into my presentation or I have a list of some questions at the end as we go. So as I look around the room, I see some familiar faces, but I also see a lot of faces that are new to me. And maybe just by a show of hands, have folks seen presentations on COMPAS? Have you heard about it? It's not super new. Okay, so I'm hopefully not going to repeat a lot that you've heard. Although I was debating doing this little, I guess, story or exercise, because I know some folks have heard it before, but there's enough that maybe haven't. So can anybody tell me who this is or what this picture is of? Please don't be shy. The Red Bull guy, that's usually the answer I get. Does anybody know what the Red Bull guy did or what he's famous for?
He jumped from basically just outside or just basically right by it.
Right. So this is, you're correct. This is Felix Baumgartner. He's an Austrian skydiver who, in October of 2012, ascended approximately 24 miles above the Earth into the stratosphere on a helium balloon of sorts. And he stepped out onto the ledge and he jumped off. So Felix broke multiple world records that day. He achieved the highest vertical jump. That record had stood for about 50 years. We'll talk a little bit about that later. He also broke the record for the fastest speed achieved without any vehicular propulsion by a human being. He went approximately 850 miles an hour. It's over Mach 1, and he broke the sound barrier with his body on the way down during his descent. Took him about just over 4 minutes to go 24 miles to the Earth's surface. So I would ask you, is he crazy? Yeah? Is he a risk taker? Definitely. An adrenaline junkie, I think. Heard that term? Absolutely, absolutely. I would argue that he took some calculated risks, though. So a little bit about the Red Bull Stratos project. So I'm not sure who initiated it. I believe Red Bull approached Felix in 2011 and told him they wanted to do this, break this world record. And they basically wrote a blank check for him and said, whatever you need to get this done. So the Red Bull Stratos project cost approximately $50 million. Okay? His spacesuit alone was over $1 million. He spent about a year prepping with multiple practice test jumps from similar heights. Felix employed an entire team of scientists full-time. He employed a retired NASA chief medical officer to be by his side, as well as, I guess he was having some problems with claustrophobia. And so he had a sports psychologist with him, helping him work through that. And so obviously he had a full battery of people. He had the latest technology funded by Red Bull in order to do this project. And so as we're talking about, there's a couple analogies here. As we're talking, though, about working with arguably one of the most dangerous slices or subsections of our population, right? It's a risk mitigation discussion. So we're constantly, I guess, in a crude way, placing bets and trying to make the best predictions or guesses possible about what kind of services we should provide, how much service, our dosages, the decisions we're making. And hopefully, while we don't have a blank check from Red Bull, we have very limited resources actually, we can employ the different decision-making tools and the research and science that is pointing us in certain directions when we're making these decisions. So that's sort of one of the analogies I want to make. I want to show you the next picture here. So a little less known. Anybody tell me who this guy is or what this is a picture of?
First space one?
No. This is Colonel Joe Kittinger. Joe made it too. So in 1960, Colonel Kittinger was the previous record holder, and in 1960 set a similar world record by jumping 19 miles high, still in the Earth's stratosphere. Joe, and I always like to read this because, I mean, it's just an amazing man. He's an officer in the U.S. Air Force. He had 2 Silver Stars, 2 Legion of Merit accommodations, 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, 24 various air medals, and a Prisoner of War medal. Joe, although did not have Red Bull backing him, it appears that Colonel Kittinger had some sort of tether tied onto him and what looks to be a tackle box of some sort duct taped to his butt. And he stepped out of the balloon. And so he succeeded as well. But it kind of provides a good juxtaposition between where we were in terms of applying tools and science to where we are today 55 years later or 60 years later. And again, the analogy then is that when we talk about risk need assessment, and certainly a lot of this presentation will be about COMPAS, and we're starting really high level and we'll drill down. But we'll also just talk about general risk need assessment too, because I'm not necessarily here to sell COMPAS. I mean, COMPAS, we use it in a lot of different areas, but it's just one tool. We could choose a different tool and have similar results. The literature kind of characterizes risk need assessment in like a generational framework. So you've got first generation risk assessment tools, which they're really not tools. It was back in the 60s and the 70s when we would mainly just use our gut. We would take as much information into it as we can. There really wasn't this actuarial science out there that we could use if we wanted to. We would really just make, I hate to say judgments, but we would make decisions about someone based on what we know, their family, their background. And through the times, we have different generations of risk assessment. So the second generation of risk assessment was really just the start of actuarial science, and we started looking at just static factors. So we were making predictions based on their prior offenses and maybe their age and things like that, but just purely static factors. And then we move into what's called the third generation of risk assessment, and that was with the advent of tools like LSIR and the Wisconsin 502 that we built back in the late 70s with NCCD. And that brought in dynamic factors. So we were not only looking at static risk factors, but we were looking at dynamic factors, such as what we now call criminogenic needs. And we'll get into that as well. And then where we are today is really this fourth generation of risk assessment. So we're looking at static factors. We're looking at research-based dynamic factors. We're talking about case management as a whole. We're automated. We're web-based. And we're using all of this information to develop a case plan and sort of a roadmap for that person. The other thing I like about the fourth generation risk assessment where we are now is it's almost swinging back to more of a, what would I say, sort of honoring the fact that experience and professional discretion is very important too. So where we almost got too much just based on the tool in the third generation assessment, we're back and saying we have to pair the science that we know with professional judgment and with our experience and collateral information and victim information and all of those other things. So that's kind of what this current generation of risk assessment and need assessment is telling us to do. So to sum up this discussion, one more thing about Colonel Kittinger and about the Red Bull Stratos project is Felix, when he was approached by Red Bull, said, I know who holds the current record, and I want to employ him and bring him back as basically my personal coach for this entire process. So at the age of 84, Colonel Kittinger was by, not literally by Felix's side, but was a coach to him through the entire preparation process and was literally right there in his headset as he jumped. And so it's pretty cool. I like this analogy because you can see how Felix also obviously had all of this science and these latest and greatest technology and tools at his disposal, but he also recognized the need to have all of that experience and the wealth of knowledge that he could employ from the previous people who are trying to do the same thing as he's doing now. So I just kind of like that analogy in that story. So let's keep moving through. Just a few objectives for today. Hopefully at the end of the next hour, hour and a half or so, we'll be able to hit on a few key things. We're just going to cover a lot of subject matter today. I'm hoping that you can take away a few key things. I'm not going to try to overwhelm you with a bunch of detail. But first and foremost, and I always talk about this, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I think it's important to just briefly hit on what we call evidence-based practice as a foundation for risk and need assessment. So risk and need assessment is just one piece of a broader continuum of strategies that we call evidence-based practice or research-based practice. So I think a lot of the folks in this room are very familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I do think it's important to set the stage with that discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about what COMPAS is, and just as importantly, what COMPAS is not. So we'll go through those. We're going to talk about some of the risk predictors as supported by research and as how we see them borne out in COMPAS. I'm going to do my best to just look under the hood a little bit of COMPAS. I don't know the proprietary risk models or the logic exactly how all the questions are weighted, but as you do enough assessments, you start to see how things are scored and how things are weighted. So I'm going to try to give you all the information I have so that you can understand why a person may score out as low, medium, or high when it comes to risk. And why we get those cases once in a while where we scratch our heads and go, why is this person coming out as high risk? There's very little in his past. Or why is he coming out as low risk? He's a train wreck right now. He's got all this stuff going on under this very heinous offense. So we'll talk a little bit about those things. I want to also expose how the assessment is administered. I know a lot of you are consumers of the information, whether you're a judge on the bench and you're looking at PSI report, or you're a treatment provider looking at the bar chart. Whatever it might be, I think we ask you to sort of take the results at face value and just trust what either DOC or the COMPAS assessment is telling you. But I want to try to show you, and for those of you who are from DOC in the room, please chime in during this. I want to show you how it's actually administered. So what the process looks like for an agent, a social worker, a classification specialist in the prison to go through and complete that assessment. So we'll walk you through that. We'll talk a little bit, about some of the safeguards in COMPAS. So there's a lot of criticisms of risk need assessment and of COMPAS. One of them is, why should we trust a tool when we know all of these offenders lie? We know they're blowing smoke. We know they're trying to portray themselves in a good light. Well, I would talk about that. I would argue some of those statements aren't exactly correct. But we do have some different validity checks in COMPAS that help us to sort of sniff out when a person might be trying to paint themselves with rose-colored glasses, if you will, and some other validity checks that are built into the system. Really, at a high level, we're going to try to read a bar chart. So there's different levels of interpretation for COMPAS. And certainly when you go through a 2-day training and you're a COMPAS assessor, you're going to get more in-depth training than you will today. But I want to try to at least have a clear understanding across this room about that first level interpretation. So when I'm looking at the bar chart, how can I kind of read it, and what do the risk bars tell me, and what do the need scales tell me? And maybe we'll try to go a little bit deeper into that as well. But we'll pull that bar chart and we'll break that down. And one of the most helpful documents, and it will be in the materials that goes out afterwards if you don't walk out with one today, is in the packet, and it's called, I think it's COMPAS Treatment or Scale Meanings and Treatment Implications Document or something like that. That has every scale that we use in COMPAS currently. And it lists them all. It talks about what domains are that feed each of those scales. So what questions go into the risk scales, what questions go into the need scales. It tells us how it's measured. It talks about what the scale actually is telling us. And it gives us some possible treatment approaches or recommendations based on our norm group and those scale results. And so we won't get into every scale today. We won't break down what does criminal opportunity actually mean. But you can take that document and you can flip to that criminal opportunity scale and you can see exactly how it's created and what it's measuring and what's feeding that scale. So that's a really helpful document for folks as they're trying to figure out what these different low and high ratings mean. And the last thing, we'll talk a little bit about norming and validation. I think that's a really important discussion to have. We talk about exactly what's going on in Wisconsin for norming as well as long-term validation of the tool. So even if we don't completely know the science and the underpinnings and how everything's weighted and things like that, we can still rest on some defensible research about the norming and the validation, the psychometric properties of COMPAS and of general risk needs assessment. So I said we're going to start really quickly on EVP. How many of you have seen this slide before? Many, most, I'm guessing. We've got a little laminated card. It's part of the propaganda that we hand out everywhere when we go. Everybody probably in DOC has one laminated somewhere. It's in your packet there. These are the 8 principles from NIC, 8 principles of effective intervention. So the bottom rung there, that bottom area is assess actuarial risk. That's risk and need, right? So that's what we're talking about today. Basically, you can't really do too much else. At least what the literature says is you can't really do too much else without knowing and conceptualizing the risk that that person poses to the community and those different criminogenic needs upon which we need to intervene. Okay, and so that's sort of the foundational level. The flip side of that, though, is a risk and needs assessment result doesn't do us any good if we don't act on the results. So California had a huge implementation of COMPAS, major overcrowding in their jails and in their prisons. We're going to use COMPAS and that's going to fix it. Well, they did hundreds of thousands of assessments and they put them in a drawer and they never used them for anything. And it's just a waste of money and a waste of time, and shame on us for the hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars we spend on a COMPAS or a risk need assessment implementation if we don't at least let those results inform our practice. So obviously it's not just good enough to do the assessment. And on and up we go. So enhancing intrinsic motivation, we're talking about engaging that client, that offender, that defendant in the change process, not just telling them what to do, rather empowering them through motivational interviewing techniques. We've heard these things. And what I'm talking about right now, of course, is the ideal world, right? So I'm not standing up here saying DOC has this all down and we do it perfect, or we do it perfect in Eau Claire County, or you know, at the statewide CJCC level, whatever that is. We're talking about the ideal world. So if you were able to hold your sort of agency up to this litmus test, you could say how well you're aligning with evidence-based practice and how great of a recidivism reduction effect you are having based on how close you're in alignment to these principles. But we know that we should be enhancing that intrinsic motivation, and ultimately long-term behavior change is affected by internal attitudes and belief change versus just external controls, right? Cuffs, electronic monitoring, GPS only gets us so far. Targeting intervention, we'll talk a little bit more of that in the next slide. That simply means targeting the need areas in that person's life that have been shown to be a problem area. Skill train with directed practice, cognitive behavioral techniques, role modeling. I am not probably going to do a great job of modeling this today. If I were, I would have you all up doing role plays and practicing and taking pre-tests and post-tests. We know that's what works best with a criminally involved population, is very concrete behavior change practicing and role playing when you're intervening. Positive reinforcement, we need to do more with incentivizing and providing positive reinforcement for our population. Once again, Department of Corrections, very good on the other side, the sanctioning, the punishment piece. But I also like to toot our horn a little bit because we're doing a lot of things in the area of positive reinforcement as well. So bonus points, I know someone knows the ratio of positives versus negatives. 4 to 1, there we go, so we know that. Engaging ongoing support in the community. We can't do it all. We can't do it in this vacuum, in this isolation. We need the entire community wraparound continuum of services. And then I told Sean I was going to call on him at some point. A little bit of Sean's area is measurement, research, looking at the data, studying the data, helping it inform practice around the outside. So that's really the NIC 8 principles. Do you have any questions as I'm going along? Okay, we'll keep moving. The R&R principle. So this is the other very well-researched, very prominent concept in the literature around criminal justice interventions. And I kind of already talked about it. It's the R&R principle, so risk needs responsivity. So basically what it says is the risk, that's very hard to read. I got to remember that for my PowerPoint slide. The risk principle says that we need to accurately assess the risk of our clientele and then focus our interventions on the medium to high risk populations, okay? So this is the most well-researched concept in all of criminal justice right now. It truly is. Center for State Governments, NIC, Pew Charitable Trust, they're not even funding studies on the risk principle anymore because it's proven over and over and over and over and over again. This dosage discussion about putting most of your services in your medium high risk population, it gives you best bang for your buck in recidivism. And your low-risk population, generally speaking, will tend to self-correct. And in fact, you know this. In fact, if you put too many services in a low-risk person, we can actually make them worse. We can do damage by overdosing, intermixing that person with folks who have more criminogenic needs. And so it's easy to say standing here from a research, cold perspective. I was in a meeting yesterday, and someone said, what am I supposed to do with this low-risk person? There's not funding for him or her to go into treatment, but if we do nothing, they are literally going to die. And that may be the case for some people. Most people, though, generally speaking, the research says is they are going to self-correct. So we just need to remember that. We don't have enough resources, whether state, local. So we need to remember that risk principle. Needs principle. Very basic. It's common sense. We intervene and we target our approaches towards the specific criminogenic needs in a person's life that are popping up, those big bars on the COMPAS report. So a real life example of this, probably 10 years ago, Jeff, in DOC, every single person on probation had a no drink, right? Well, times are changing a little bit. If they don't have a substance use issue, we don't necessarily need to either put a lot of controls or a lot of treatment services in that area. We're targeting the needs that are most operative. And we know on the back of that card, right, you have the top big 4 and the lesser 4. We've gone over those too. Some needs are more crime producing. That's what criminogenic means than others. And the responsivity principle, which is, I think, oftentimes the hardest for us to really wrap our heads around. And really that means tailoring our interventions to the individual characteristics of the person. So we're talking about anything from mental health issues, taking those into account, learning style, gender, motivation, all of these different areas that we know are maybe not proven through research as criminogenic as much, but they are definitely factors we have to take into account. Don't put somebody into a treatment group, a cognitive behavioral group with an 8th or a 6th grade reading level if they can only read at a 3rd grade reading level. How are we going to help them get the most out of their treatment experience? So, real high level again, and I promise we're going to get to COMPAS very soon. Maybe the next slide. There we go. So we'll start drilling down a little bit more into exactly what COMPAS is, but it's important to understand that those evidence-based principles are the reason why we're putting into place a risk and need assessment tool. So COMPAS does a lot of different things for us, different things for different agencies, different people using the software. First and foremost, it is a risk and need assessment system. And so generally speaking, we get 3 measures of risk. When we do this assessment, and we'll get to what it looks like and how we assess, how we administer it, we get 3 different measures of risk. First and foremost, we get general risk. So that simply means the likelihood that a person is going to commit any new crime within 2 years of the assessment. Actually, some of the North Point research, as they continue their validation studies, they're saying 3 years is, the risk predictions are staying very stable for 3 years, so we could probably say 3 years. It's a reassessment discussion, but suffice it to say that it's predicting the likelihood of a new crime, any new crime, within 2 years, now 3 years post-assessment. It also gives you a measure of violent risk. So what it's telling us is how likely the person is to commit a new crime of violence within the next 2 years. And then last but not least, we have a pretrial measure in there as well that can be done on its own as a 14-item assessment, or it can be done, you automatically get those results in the larger assessment. And that's simply the likelihood that a person is going to show up for another court appearance based on their history of absconding, transience, stable employment, all of those different things. And so we get those 3 measures of risk, and those are those red bars on the bar chart, right? So it's also a needs assessment, so then we get all the green bars. We'll look at those a little bit later. We call those criminogenic needs, and those are the areas in a person's life that, if left unaddressed, can contribute to future criminal behavior. So it gives us an entire domain or battery of diagnostic scales. Everything from, I mentioned, substance abuse, several measures of criminal thinking, stability, job, housing, school, family, antisocial peers, all these different areas that we know can have an effect on criminal behavior. And that's how we operationalize that needs principle. We have a case planning module in there. The rest of this I'll just go over really quickly. I talked about 4th generational tools, being able to automate, show those results, and then move those into a case plan, because then, of course, those criminogenic needs, the highest ones, of course, are sort of the grist for the mill of the case plan, of the treatment plan. So it's an automated case planning module for our case managers, those who use COMPAS in that way. We have a lot of other case management software in there that the department uses. Everything from social history to rules of supervision. As most of you know, we're automating the PSI through COMPAS now, so we're taking all this assessment information, the social history information, and moving it into a PSI report. It's web-based, so COMPAS users know that you really can get to COMPAS from any access point that has the internet, as long as you have your username and password. It is very much supported by research. North Point is the owner of COMPAS. It is a proprietary software, just like LSIR or CASE here from NCCD in Madison. They have a team of researchers out in Golden, Colorado that continually update the assessment. And actually, it kind of gets frustrating sometimes because they're adding questions, they're taking away questions, and we're having a hard time staying up with how the assessment sort of morphs over time. That's because new research emerges about what's more predictive and what's less predictive, and how can we achieve the same amount of accuracy with the least amount of questions, resource issue and things like that. So again, at a high level, that's kind of what COMPAS is. Do folks have questions about that? Okay. So also important, and I know if you're member of the judiciary sitting in this room. You've seen this slide before. Many of you have. I think it's important to talk about what COMPAS doesn't tell us or what it is not. So number one, COMPAS is not a crime-specific risk predictor. And I know this is one of the hot topics that we want to spend a few minutes on. So what I mean by that is there are both broadband assessment tools and narrowband assessment tools, right? So COMPAS is considered a broadband actuarial risk assessment. That is, it's looking at general crime predictors. It's what the body of research and knowledge represents out there about pathways to crime. Not pathways to OWI or not pathways to forgery, but general crime. So we're looking at the preponderance of criminal history in the past and patterns of behavior and all of these different things that lead to general criminality. It's not intended to predict, though, the likelihood of any one crime. It doesn't take into account specific factors. So we get questions all the time, right? We hear about, well, oh, all OWI offenders are coming out low risk, or DV offenders just aren't seeming to score out correctly on COMPAS. Sex offenders is another one, right, that we hear. All the sex offenders come out as low risk. Sex offenders is an interesting one, and we won't have a lot of time to get into it. There's a couple arguments there. Number one, it's actually assessing sex offenders pretty well because sex offenders are low risk. I mean, it's a hard thing to say, but research bears out time after time in the recidivism studies. They tend to recidivate at a low rate. If you keep your eyes on the Wisconsin DOC website, public website, if you just Google Wisconsin DOC, in the next few weeks we're putting out a recidivism report for about 20 years worth of sex offenders coming through the department. And we're following them 10 and 15 years out. Even at that 15-year mark, I saw advanced preview at one of our meetings of the stats. We're at like 5-6% recidivism rate. It's really mind-boggling how long and how low risk our sex offender population tends to be. Now, I'm not standing here saying the impact of a sex reoffense isn't great on our community, isn't devastating to everyone involved. And I'm also not saying that means we don't put any services in them or we don't supervise them well. That's not the case. It's simply that when you're looking at a risk prediction for that population, your risk predictors are oftentimes going to be low. Now, that being said, COMPAS, though, isn't looking at sex offense-specific crime-producing behaviors. So for those of us who are experts in working with sex offenders, what do we know? It sounds stereotypical. We're looking at use of pornography, deviant sexual arousal, power and control issues, all these things. COMPAS isn't looking at those dynamic factors. For that, we would say you want to use a narrow-band screener, an alternative screening, such as a static 99 or a stable or an acute. We're trying to get those implemented in the department. We're doing static 99s on many of our PSIs that are coming through the courts, but that's a training issue. We got to get all of our staff trained up on that, so I don't know that they're always coming through in the reports to sort of augment the COMPAS scores. OWI, similar. OWI is a very difficult concept when it comes to assessment. So there are some assessment tools out there that will look specifically at OWI risk. We don't have any built into COMPAS at this time. They tend to be pretty long. So the ASUDS, if you're familiar with that, I believe is a very long assessment. It's been shown to predict OWI offense pretty well. The other one I mentioned yesterday in a meeting is the intoxicated driver assessment is really coming forward in the literature now. You can write down IDA and research that. It was a partnership. I think it was either APPA or ACA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Board to develop this OWI risk tool. Problem with it is it's expensive to train. It's 4-day training, and there's very few trainers out there. I know that the DOJ, Wisconsin DOJ, is doing some work to try to be able to offer that training, especially for how many OWI courts and different specialty courts we have in Wisconsin. But what the research would say is that, yes, again, COMPAS is just predicting general criminality. So I'll be stereotypical for a second time and say, oftentimes, what do our chronic OWI offenders look like? They may be a little older. They might be white. They may not have a lot of other risk factors. They might have decent jobs, families, all of these things that aren't going to spike a COMPAS bar chart. but they do have there's something going on there that when they drink, they not only like to drink, they drive as well. So we need to look at those offense-specific tools. The department's trying to. We brought some trainers in for IDA training and trained some of our staff, but we have a long ways to go on that. So those are the issues between broadband, narrowband. Same exact discussion for DV. We do have a DV tool in COMPAS that we can use. It's called the DVSIR. I know, Tiana, your staff are looking into that. There's a training piece for that as well, and I believe that's just started to be implemented here in Eau Claire, correct? You guys are using it. So what the research would say is that in the ideal world, absent of resource issues and if everything else is equal, again, red bull blank check, we would do both assessments. We would do a COMPAS assessment and we would do a DV assessment, or we would do an OWI assessment, and let both of those inform our decision making. But there's also research out there that says don't necessarily chase after every offense-specific tool if you're not solid in doing general risk assessment first. Because first and foremost, you should have that general risk assessment tool. So that's a little bit about the crime-specific, risk predictor and what it is and what it's not. And that's not to say that COMPAS doesn't have many sex offenders in the norming population, many OWI offenders, many DV offenders. So I think it's inaccurate to say, it's sort of semantics, it's inaccurate to say that COMPAS isn't valid for those populations. It is. It's just not taking account into all the risk factors to truly get a really good risk score on that population. It's not a perfect predictor. So we talked about this yesterday. Let's see. Let me actually. So without getting into too much detail, when you look at research, if you're into reading these reports, when you look at actuarial risk prediction, there's a statistical term that's used for actuarial risk assessments called an area under the curve score, or an AUC score you'll see in the data. And that score is basically an estimate of how well the tool is at predicting what it says it's predicting, validity. And COMPAS, LSIR, all of the sort of the industry standard risk assessment tools now are achieving fairly similar AUC scores. They're generally somewhere between 0.69 and 0.73. Some of the latest validation studies on COMPAS are about 0.72, 0.73. And basically what that means is 71, 72, 73% of the time, COMPAS is accurately predicting risk. Okay? On the back page, on the last slide of this presentation, there's some links to some different research studies. If you're interested in looking at those, you can go online and find those. So that's eye-opening for some people, and it was for me the first time I saw it, because that means 27, 28, 29% of the time, COMPAS is not right. We have false positives and false negatives, right? So it can overestimate risk. It can say someone is a high risk to reoffend, and that person, luckily, and we're happy about this, they don't reoffend, right? Or it can underestimate risk. It can say someone is low risk, and those are the ones we worry about. Those are the ones we worry about seeing in the headlines, where we make a decision based on that and other things to say that they're low risk, and we're going to put less correctional dosage into them, if you will, and they do commit a new crime. And so that's just the facts about actuarial risk prediction. We like to think that the science will get better over time, but in the end, I don't know. I feel like we're human beings and we're irrational and unpredictable creatures, and so it's going to be hard to predict with a lot greater accuracy risk in that way. But that said, and some of you have seen me say this too, how well are we as human beings doing that same thing, predicting risk? Just interviewing someone, looking at some collateral information, not using any actuarial tool, and just making a judgment saying, yes, they're going to stay crime-free, or no, they're not, they're going to screw up in the future. It's just about right. We're a little better than a flip of a coin. They've researched this. They say 51, 52% of the time we are correct. Go ahead.
I've done a lot of 980 defense work,
Yeah.
so I'm pretty well versed in this. I think the area under the curve, we need to keep in mind that a flip of a coin would have a 50% area under the curve. So
Yeah.
what you're looking at is just marginally better than
Right.
And an area under the curve of, 69% might sound like really good, but I wouldn't put my money on it necessarily. And when you're talking about informing these decisions with your own judgment, you may be decreasing what marginal benefit you have. So I think we need to be really careful. I've seen 100 of these cases, and in my experience, because that is not necessarily going to get you better information.
Yeah. The actuarial risk rating versus the clinical judgment. There you go. There you go. Yeah, and I agree, and that's why I started out saying what I did, in that we need to remember that we can't. Hopefully you don't come away from this hearing me say that we should only make our decisions based on a computer program or based on an actuarial risk tool. That we should use our clinical judgment, absolutely. There are studies out there that say the pairing, the augmentation of research-based tools with clinical judgment can get us, I'm not sure how they've measured it. I can get you the studies if you're interested. Get us up closer to the 80% mark. I'm not sure. But there are research studies out there that will say that, and I have the citations if you're interested. So that's simply that caution, and I'm agreeing with you in that it's not the panacea. It's not so we hit the next one, replacement for professional discretion. I don't need to say any more about that. And it's not an in-out decision tool. So our friends in the judiciary, our friends in the defense bar, I always try to say this, that it would be an inappropriate application of the tool to in a vacuum, say that all high-risk offenders must be locked up and throw away the key, or we're looking at prison time commensurate with their risk level. Now, there is a discussion to be had there. I know I'm sort of, kind of on the fence here, but there's a discussion to be had in terms of that risk principle, and moderate and high risk getting more correctional service, whether that's be, probation, supervision, treatment, dosage hours in a cognitive behavioral program, or even confinement. There's a discussion to be had there, but we should never look at a bar chart and say low risk means I am going to keep someone in the community, and high risk means I'm going to send them to prison. It's so much more. And I know the judges in the room know, with all the gallium factors and all of those things, that's just, it's one small, another nugget of information that we can use to help inform our decisions. In fact, I would argue that in the terms of a sentencing context, we're looking less at the risk level and more at all of the other criminogenic needs and treatment factors and social history information that COMPAS brings when we're making decisions at a sentencing event. So we'll keep moving on this. Okay, so here's where I'm going to try to do my best to help you see a little bit more about how the risk tool works. So when we talk about, I talked about static factors and dynamic factors before. The way COMPAS risk assessment works, and most general actuarial risk assessments work, LSIR, is that it very heavily weights prior record and static factors, okay? So the big three, there's big three out there. We heard of you're using the proxy tool, law enforcement, right now. What are the big three predictors of risk? Age at first arrest, current age, and criminal history. Across tools, whatever tool you're talking about, I don't know exactly the pluses and minuses, percentage points, but the weights are most heavily on those three factors. And to a little lesser extent, but certainly very predictive, failures on parole, failures in supervision. And so those static factors primarily drive the risk score. However, there are other dynamic factors in COMPAS that do weigh into it, and some of those are substance use, criminal associates, and vocation and education. Go ahead.
I have a question about this, because if you have an individual that's going to come up moderate to high risk, it is driven by those static factors. Those static factors are never going to change. So if you do the COMPAS when the guy is 25, and then he comes back, with a retail theft or whatever we're doing when he's 40, he's going to have a similar risk. That risk isn't going to necessarily decrease. So, I have a concern, because if the risk is the focus, the guy may have been crime free free, and, you know, some external thing happened, and here we are again. I fear that the idea of risk is going to be overplayed without looking at the rest of the picture.
So there's a couple pieces to that. First of all, we call them static. The age will change. There's a desistance curve. If you like freeze someone and assess them at 25 and then move forward and change nothing and assess them at 40, that risk rating likely will drop based on age alone.
But not significantly.
It may. We don't know the weighting of the questions. So we don't know how much, but we know that that current age is very operative. That criminal history will build, so that will change over time as well, potentially. The weighting of a current offense versus the prior offenses, I know, will change as well. And we can't discount, even though they're lesser in terms of the weighting, we can't discount those dynamic factors as well. So the flip side, the devil's advocate to it is, and there's probably more than two camps, is how much do we want, from a policy standpoint, to base a risk rating on dynamic factors that are accumulated or input into the system on a combination of collateral information, offender interview, and those things, or criminal thinking factors, for that matter, that are very much in fluctuation. So it's finding that sweet spot between the very solid factual information, but also the dynamic information that changes a lot.
Do you know if they are studying, they're taking a COMPAS, say from 2010, and then doing any type of study groups with these guys 5 years later to see if there is a change in those the risk factors?
Yeah.
I guess I'm just really curious as to how much of a significant change there is, proprietary or not.
Yeah,
Because
right.
I'm concerned because that static portion drives so much.
I know that they're continually following their norm group, their composite norms, and doing, adding another year at-risk follow-up time to their validation. What they're doing, actually looking at that group and, in terms of sort of an artificial reassessment to see where they're at, I'm not sure. I don't know how much they're doing that. So I can't completely say for sure.
So, Jared?
Yeah.
So the one that I'm seeing that I just wonder about the accuracy is when we get to like 18-year-olds who maybe even still in hand.
Yeah.
Because their current age is low. They may have no juvenile record or no other record, but their age of first arrest is low.
Right.
They're going to be low on vocation education because they haven't gotten out of school yet, and a lot of them have substance abuse issues, and they're going to come out
Yeah.
no history. I mean,
Yeah.
does that make sense?
I think it does make sense, and I think your statement is correct. I think knowing, again, these factors, an 18-year-old is at the height of that risky period. They are the most impulsive. I mean, I am not using it today, but we often talk about the insurance rates analogy. Your highest, your highest insurance premiums are for your 16, 17, 18-year-old son or daughter. So yes, so they are going to be higher risk in that area. Criminal history, though, if there is little to no criminal history, that's going to pull back a little bit, especially if that age at first arrest is so predictive. At least that's what I'm told. That's what the research says, that age at first arrest. So if there's not an age at first arrest down in the 13, 14, 15 years range, that's going to pull back as well and be a protective factor. There's more than 30 questions that drive the risk score, so it's almost a case-by-case discussion of what's going to happen. But I think generally your caution is a good point, that we need to look at those young kids, and it has an implication for the end result, the intervention, because what we don't want to do is take that kid who maybe hasn't been involved in the criminal justice system before, who maybe isn't super criminal, and then put them into a higher risk group population and make them worse.
That's what worries me.
Yes, I agree.
I mean, they do stupid things and they're impulsive.
Right.
If you get picked up with some pot or we talk that, and you come up medium, maybe barely medium because of your age and criminal history, maybe you do have a your friends all smoke pot, you really don't still want to stick
Yeah.
them in the criminal justice system
I agree.
after first.
I agree. That's like, and Jeff, I know, won't call you out, but I know you're thinking about these things. When we look at violations and we look at possible ATRs or a revocation and someone going to jail or prison, I cringe when I see the 18, 19-year-old kid, the first exposure, and that happening. So I can't speak for the DOC in terms of how often or why or when. Obviously, those are local decisions, but your point is well made, and there's an override discussion to be had. So one of the points I think questions was, when do overrides occur, how often, why, who's approving, all of that piece. So one of the things about a fourth generational tool, I will get to your question, I see it. One of the things about a fourth generational tool is it has a formalized override piece built in. And so when we might see a case, maybe not unlike the one you're describing, and maybe they're coming up as medium or high, and the flip side applies too. We may override to a higher risk score. When I say override, I mean it can also go the other way. There are two things that the agent is trained to look for. And please, DOC staff, please chime in if I'm mischaracterizing this. Number one, what are the aggravating or mitigating factors? So some of the things you're talking about. But also, especially for overrides, how are we justifying the extra amount of time or exposure we're putting into that person? So this person's a hot mess right now. They need to be supervised at max. They need to be a highest risk. Well, is something magical happening about them walking into the probation office that's actually going to help them? And in fact, we would argue that the probation office is probably a pretty criminogenic area in terms of mixing with other higher risk people. So what are the specific things, the dosage that we're going to do? We're going to override because we're going to spend time on a cognitive restructuring process through carry guides, through bits, through change journals. We're going to put them in a group, things like that. So those are the two pieces that we need for an override. And that would apply too if we're going to underride, if you will, to someone. Then we do have to have a supervisor's approval, and that's documented in COMPAS. And so that's kind of what that looks like. I haven't looked at our latest override rates to kind of see where we are. The authors of the tool, and generally research says, for general risk assessment, is you should be between 10 and 15% override rates. And it gets back to, I suppose, those AUC scores. And so I think my guess, the last time I looked, we're probably a little higher than that. We're still not completely trusting the tool all the time. And maybe we have some work to do there. But right. So yeah, I'm speaking from a DOC application, but you're doing it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess my thought is for some of these kids, and it's like you have to get everything, you probably don't even want them over at the probation
Right.
department,
Yeah. But
looking at
yep. And we've seen a drop. I always hold Eau Claire up as a model. We have job security either way, but we've seen a drop of low-risk people coming from the Eau Claire courts, and that's great as far as I'm concerned, because they're the ones that our agents, I think, like to work with, but they're not the ones we should be working with. We should be putting our time into the medium and high-risk group. So easy to preach that. We still have a ways to go on that culture shift. Your question.
Well, and that was the point I was going to make, the HPO well, and just sometimes when we get the compass and all of a sudden it's medium, it's like, why is he medium? We're like,
Yeah.
how could he possibly be medium? He's a nice kid,
Yeah.
goes to school, so he's so fast.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
Look, every time I get the questions a lot. First thing I do is I go look at these three. Same for a gentleman who comes in at 50 years old with a heinous sex offense or a homicide or whatever it might be. How can this guy be low risk? Well, he hasn't had a criminal event since he was 24. He's now 50-something, and he wasn't even involved in the juvenile justice system. I don't care what your current offense is. You're not going to come up as a high risk on a general risk predictor tool. Doesn't mean we don't override, but that's the thing. Got a hand in the back. Yes? Great question. And I'm reminded, this is the first time I remembered I'm supposed